The only sounds were the rain against the window pane, a frantic, desperate rhythm, and their breathing tangled together in the dark. A sliver of pale moonlight cut through the blinds, illuminating a landscape of tangled limbs and damp skin. Her fingers dug into the hard muscle of his back, a silent plea for him to stop, and a desperate command for him to never let go. "Liam," she breathed, the name a painful whisper, a sin on her tongue. "Please, we can't. Mark." But the word "can't" was a ghost on her lips, forgotten as his mouth found the sensitive skin of her neck, and a low moan escaped her throat, betraying every rational thought. Her body arched against his, a will of its own, chasing a pleasure so sharp, so forbidden, it felt like ruin. He was the storm inside her quiet house, and she was willingly letting herself be swept away, lost in the raw electric feeling of his skin against hers, the scent of him overwhelming her senses, drowning out everything but the here and now. But this fire, this all-consuming, destructive heat, had started with a simple spark, just 3 weeks before, in the sterile quiet of her perfect life. Alara stood alone in her vast modern kitchen, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filling the air. The table was set for two, with polished silverware and cloth napkins. Everything was in its place, just as her husband, Mark, liked it. Her phone buzzed on the cold granite countertop, the screen lighting up with a familiar message. "Working late, client dinner." "Don't wait up." The words were casual, almost routine, yet each one landed like a small, cold stone in the pit of her stomach. The silence of the house pressed in on her. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was Mark, his voice cheerful, oblivious. "Honey, bad news and good news," he'd said. "Liam's band broke up, and he split with his girlfriend. He needs a place to crash for a few weeks, just to get back on his feet. I told him he could stay with us. Is that okay?" Alara had looked around the empty, silent house, at the second plate on the table growing cold, and had simply said, "Of course, he's family." She had no idea she was not just welcoming her husband's brother, but inviting in the very temptation that would shatter her world from the inside out. He arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of slate. Alara watched from the living room window as a dusty, dark green Subaru Forester, a car that looked like it had seen more of the country than most people, rumbled into her pristine driveway. It seemed out of place next to Mark's silver Tesla, a stark contrast between a life lived on the road and one lived in boardrooms. The driver's door opened, and Liam unfolded himself from the car. He was not what she had expected. Mark's descriptions had painted a picture of a younger, less focused version of himself, but the man standing in her driveway was a different creature entirely. Where Mark was sharp angles and polished precision, Liam was a collection of softer lines, of comfortable, worn-in edges. He wore faded jeans that hung loosely on his hips, a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across a frame that was lean but strong, and scuffed leather boots. He ran a hand through his messy brown hair, a gesture of exhaustion and relief, before pulling a heavy backpack from the passenger seat, followed by a camera bag that looked like an extension of his own body. Then he looked towards the house and he smiled. It wasn't the polite, measured smile of her husband. It was a genuine, slightly crooked smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and for a moment, it made the gloomy day seem a little brighter. Mark greeted him at the door with a loud, booming welcome and a firm, brotherly hug that seemed more performative than affectionate. "Look at you, road warrior," Mark had said, slapping his back. "Alara, Liam's here." Mark gave him the grand tour, his voice echoing in the minimalist space as he pointed out the smart thermostat, the imported Italian marble countertops, the state-of-the-art entertainment system. He was a docent in his own museum, showcasing a life of curated success. Liam nodded along politely, his eyes, a deep, thoughtful hazel, taking everything in, but not with the awe Mark seemed to expect. It felt more like he was studying a foreign habitat. Within 30 minutes, Mark was glancing at his watch. "Got a big conference call, buddy. Make yourself at home. Alara will take care of you." And just like that, he was gone, his footsteps echoing up the stairs to his home office, leaving a sudden, palpable silence in his wake. The energy in the house shifted. The air, which had been charged with Mark's restless corporate ambition, settled into something softer, more inquisitive. "He's always that busy?" Liam asked, his voice a low, gentle baritone that seemed to absorb the silence rather than break it. He runs on a different frequency, Alara replied, offering a small, apologetic smile. Coffee? He accepted with that same warm smile from the driveway and followed her into the kitchen. As she moved around the space, measuring coffee grounds, pulling mugs from the cabinet, she could feel his eyes on her, not in a leering way, but with a quiet, artistic observance. He wasn't just looking, he was seeing. He leaned against the counter, his presence filling the room in a way that was completely different from Mark's. Mark's presence was an occupation, a declaration of ownership. Liam's was an inhabitation, a quiet merging with the space around him. "This is incredible," he said suddenly, nodding towards a small, abstract watercolor painting hanging by the breakfast nook, a swirl of deep blues and teals. "The way you captured the light. It feels like looking at the ocean at dusk." "Did you paint it?" Alara froze, her hand hovering over the coffee machine. She had painted that piece over a year ago. Mark had walked past it thousands of times, his eyes scanning his phone, and had never once commented on it. Yes, I did," she stammered, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "It's just a hobby." He shook his head, pushing himself off the counter to get a closer look. "That's not a hobby, Alara. That's a talent. You have a real eye." He didn't say it with the empty flattery she was used to from Mark's colleagues. He said it with the quiet conviction of a fellow artist, a simple statement of fact. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't realized was dormant inside her, pride. The conversation flowed easily after that. As they sat at the kitchen island, sipping their coffee, he asked about her work as an interior designer. He didn't just ask how it was, he asked what it was. He wanted to know about her process, about the challenge of translating a client's scattered ideas into a cohesive, beautiful space. He listened, truly listened, nodding and understanding, his gaze never leaving her face. He shared stories from his travels, describing the colors of a New Mexico sunset, the sound of the wind in the giant sequoias, the faces of the people he'd photographed. He spoke of his passions with a raw, unguarded honesty that was both refreshing and slightly intimidating. Alara found herself opening up in a way she hadn't with anyone in years, not even Mark. She talked about the architecture degree she'd started but never finished, the dream of designing homes from the ground up that she had quietly shelved in favor of a safer career. Liam didn't offer platitudes or solutions. He just listened, his expression full of an empathy that made her feel seen in a way that was profound and a little unsettling. She became acutely aware of the little things about him. The way a single dimple appeared on his left cheek when he was genuinely amused. The way he would absently trace the rim of his coffee mug with his thumb as he listened to her. The subtle scent that clung to him, not of expensive cologne like Mark, but something earthier, like cedarwood and rain and old books. It was a scent that felt real, lived in. When she stood up to rinse their mugs, he stood as well, taking his from her hand. "Let me," he said, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The touch was nothing, a simple accidental contact, but it sent a tiny jolt through her system, a spark of unexpected electricity. Their eyes met over the sink, and in that brief moment, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. It was a recognition of a shared wavelength, a quiet understanding that was already deeper and more intimate than anything she had felt with her own husband in years. As he went to settle into the guest room for the afternoon, Alara was left standing in the silent kitchen, her heart beating just a little faster than normal. She told herself she was just being a gracious hostess, a kind sister-in-law. But as she touched the spot on her hand where his fingers had grazed hers, she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was already more than that. The quiet of her house was no longer empty. It was filled with him. The days that followed settled into a new, quiet rhythm, a domestic harmony that felt both natural and dangerously seductive. Mark's presence in the house became a fleeting thing, a ghost in the early morning and a tired body late at night. He would leave before the sun had a chance to burn the mist off the lawn, his hurried footsteps on the hardwood floors the only sign he had been there at all. But the house no longer felt empty in his absence. It was filled with Liam. Their mornings became a ritual, a silent pact made in the soft gray light of the Pacific Northwest dawn. They would meet in the kitchen, two solitary figures drawn together by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Their conversations drifted away from the profound and into the intimate tapestry of daily life. He learned that she couldn't stand the sound of chewing, that she had a secret love for old black and white movies, that she hummed a soft, tuneless melody when she watered the row of succulents on the windowsill. She, in turn, discovered that he slept on his stomach, that he added a dash of cinnamon to his coffee, and that he had a faint scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood cycling accident. They were trivial details, the kind of meaningless minutiae that a husband and wife are supposed to share, and the ease with which they shared them felt more intimate than any confession. Alara began to change in ways even she didn't fully acknowledge at first. The worn-out gray sweatpants she usually lived in were relegated to the back of her drawer, replaced by soft black leggings and cashmere sweaters that draped elegantly over her frame. She started waking up a few minutes earlier, not to prepare for Mark, but to brush her hair until it shone, to apply a touch of tinted moisturizer that evened her skin tone, to dab a hint of perfume on her wrists. She told herself it was an act of self-care, a way to reclaim a small piece of herself in the vast emptiness of her days. But when she would walk into the kitchen and see Liam's eyes light up with a quiet appreciation, a warmth would spread through her chest that was both thrilling and terrifying. She was becoming aware of her own body again, not as the wife of Mark, but as Alara, a woman seen through the eyes of a man who truly saw her. The house, once a sprawling, lonely space, began to feel smaller, the air between them charged with an unspoken energy. Every shared space became a potential point of contact, a landscape of near misses and charged glances. One morning, she was coming down the hallway, lost in thought, just as he was emerging from the guest bathroom, a cloud of steam billowing out behind him. He had nothing on but a white towel slung low around his hips, clinging precariously to his lean waist. Droplets of water clung to his shoulders and traced paths down his chest, getting lost in the dark, intricate lines of a tattoo of a raven's feather that curled around his ribs. His hair was dark and damp, slicked back from his forehead, and his skin glowed with a healthy, vibrant flush. He was beautiful, not in a polished, curated way, but in a raw, vital way that made the air catch in her lungs. Their eyes met for a single, suspended second. He offered a sheepish, lopsided grin, while a deep, burning blush crept up Alara's neck. She quickly averted her gaze, murmuring a flustered good morning as she hurried past, but the image was seared into her mind. Throughout the day, it would flash in her thoughts unbidden, the hard line of his collarbone, the way the muscles in his abdomen tightened as he moved, the dark trail of hair that disappeared beneath the edge of the towel. It was a private, secret fantasy, a dangerous thing to own. She began to notice his scent everywhere. It clung to the throw blanket on the sofa where he'd been sitting. It lingered in the hallway after he passed, a subtle, masculine blend of pine-scented soap and something uniquely him. It was the smell of the outdoors, of a life lived without walls, and she found herself breathing it in deeply, a guilty pleasure that made her stomach flutter. The tension was a low hum beneath the surface of their polite conversations, a string pulled taut between them, vibrating with every shared laugh, every accidental touch. And then, one rainy afternoon, the string snapped. Alara was in the study, a room Mark had designed to be his sanctuary but rarely used. She was trying to retrieve a heavy, oversized book on Japanese architecture from the very top shelf. She was on her tiptoes on the small library ladder, her fingers just brushing the spine of the book, her body stretched taut. She was so focused, she didn't hear him enter the room. One moment she was alone, and the next, he was there. He didn't speak. He simply stepped onto the floor behind her, his body a warm, solid presence at her back. He reached up, his arms caging her in as his hands easily closed around the heavy book. For a breathless moment, she was completely surrounded by him. Her back was flush against his chest. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. His arm brushed against her side, and his face was so close to hers that she could feel the warmth of his breath stirring the fine hairs on her neck. "Be careful, Alara," he whispered, his voice a low, intimate rumble that vibrated through her entire body. The words were simple, an expression of concern. But the tone, the proximity, the heat of him, it was anything but simple. It was a warning and an invitation all at once. He stepped back as quickly as he had appeared, breaking the spell. He held the book out to her. "This is the one?" he asked, his voice returning to normal, but his eyes held a knowing glint. As she took it from him, their fingers brushed. It was no longer an accident. It was a confirmation. She stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs, the heavy book in her hands feeling weightless compared to the crushing significance of that single, stolen moment. The air was no longer just charged. It was combustible. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning. Mark, already dressed in a crisp suit, was speaking into his AirPods, pacing the length of the kitchen. The investors moved the meeting up. "I have to be in San Francisco by tomorrow morning. I'll be gone until Saturday." He delivered the news with the detached efficiency of an assistant reading an itinerary. He gave Alara a quick, dry kiss on the cheek, his mind already 3 states away, his scent of expensive cologne and ambition already fading from the room. "Liam's here, so you won't be alone," he'd added as an afterthought. The front door clicked shut, and the sound of his Tesla purring out of the driveway was like a starting pistol firing into the quiet morning. A 3-day reprieve. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. The house, which had already begun to feel small with the 3 of them, suddenly felt both cavernously large and dangerously intimate. The unspoken rules, the careful boundaries they had all been navigating, vanished with the fading sound of Mark's car. That first day and night passed in a haze of nervous, unspoken anticipation. They kept a careful distance, as if acknowledging the sudden absence of their chaperone, the man who was both the link between them and the barrier. They ate dinner at opposite ends of the long dining table, the empty chairs between them a testament to the space they were trying to maintain. But the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with unspoken possibilities. The air itself seemed to crackle with a low-grade static, an energy that hummed just beneath the surface of their polite conversation. By the second evening, the pretense had started to fray. A storm had rolled in from the coast, a classic Oregon deluge that beat against the windows and rattled the eaves, cocooning the house in a world of its own. The power flickered once, twice, casting the room in momentary darkness and drawing a sharp gasp from Alara before it held steady. "Looks like we're not going anywhere," Liam said, his voice a calm anchor in the tempest outside. "Movie night?" Alara agreed, her heart giving a strange, fluttery leap. She went upstairs to change, and this time, the choice was a conscious one. She stood before her closet, pushing past the sensible cotton pajamas and flannel sets, her fingers finally closing around the soft, cool slip of a silk nightgown the color of midnight. It was a gift from Mark, from a long-ago anniversary, an item she had never worn, feeling it was too decadent, too much, for their practical, passionless nights. Over it, she slipped on a matching long robe. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw a stranger looking back. Her skin seemed to glow against the dark silk, the fabric hinting at the curves beneath without revealing them. This wasn't the comfortable, slightly invisible wife of Mark. This was Alara. It was a deliberate act of reclamation, a shedding of a skin that had grown too tight. When she came back downstairs, the living room was lit only by the soft glow of a lamp and the flickering television screen. Liam had already poured 2 glasses of a deep red wine, its legs clinging to the sides of the glasses. He was sitting on one end of the large sectional sofa, and when he looked up at her, his breath caught for a fraction of a second. His eyes traveled over her, a slow, appreciative sweep that made her feel more naked than if she had been wearing nothing at all. He didn't compliment her. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. She sat on the opposite end of the sofa, curling her feet up beneath her, pulling the robe tighter as if to ward off a chill that wasn't there. The movie began. Some critically acclaimed drama neither of them was actually watching. The real film was the silent, charged space between them. The sound of the rain, the clink of their wine glasses, their soft breathing. It was the only soundtrack that mattered. The wine worked its magic, warming her blood and loosening the tightly coiled knot of anxiety in her stomach. It also loosened their tongues. He began to speak, his voice low and melancholic, telling her about his ex-girlfriend, about the painful end of their relationship. But he spoke less of the heartbreak and more of the gnawing sense of failure, the feeling of being artistically and emotionally adrift. "It's like I lost my eye," he confessed, staring into his wine glass. "I look through the lens, and I don't see anything worth capturing anymore. I lost my voice." He was showing her his wounds, the raw, vulnerable parts of himself he kept hidden from the world, from his successful older brother. His confession was a key, unlocking a door inside Alara she had kept bolted for years. She found herself speaking of her own quiet loneliness, her own sense of being adrift in a life that looked perfect from the outside. "This house is so beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but sometimes walking through it feels like walking through a stranger's home. It's Mark's masterpiece. I'm just the final piece of furniture he chose to complete the look. A single, traitorous tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, he moved. He shifted across the vast expanse of the sofa, closing the distance between them in one fluid motion. He knelt on the floor in front of her, his presence sudden and overwhelming. He reached out, his calloused thumb impossibly gentle as it intercepted the tear, brushing it from her skin. His touch was like a brand, a point of heat that seemed to singe her skin. His hand didn't retreat. It stayed, his thumb now resting on her cheekbone, his fingers lightly cradling her jaw. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could smell the wine on his breath, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The world outside, the rain, the house, the movie, her husband in San Francisco, it all faded away into a muffled hum. There was only the intense, searching look in his eyes. He studied her face, his gaze filled with a profound, heartbreaking understanding that stripped her bare. "You have the saddest eyes, Alara," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. It wasn't a pickup line, it was a diagnosis. It was an acknowledgement of every unspoken disappointment, every lonely night, every silent tear she had ever shed. He saw it all. He saw her. In that moment, the last thread of her resistance snapped. He was no longer her husband's brother. He was the only person in the world who saw the truth. And every part of her, every starved and neglected corner of her soul, leaned into his touch. The boundary hadn't just blurred, it had completely, irrevocably dissolved. His words, a soft, devastating truth, hung in the air between them, shimmering in the lamplight. "You have the saddest eyes, Alara." It was a key turning in a lock she didn't know was rusted shut. In that moment, he saw past the perfect wife, the gracious hostess, and looked directly into the hollow, lonely core of her. The breath she was holding escaped her in a shaky sigh, and it was all the invitation he needed. He leaned in, slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, giving her every opportunity to retreat, to turn her head, to erect the barrier that should have been there. But she was paralyzed, caught in the tractor beam of his empathy, of his desire. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a violent collision, but a soft, tentative press, a question asked without words. For a heartbeat, she remained perfectly still, the ghost of her husband's name, the concept of right and wrong, flashing behind her closed eyelids. Her hands came up, landing on his chest in a gesture of protest that had no strength, no conviction. "Liam," she whispered against his mouth, the name a surrender, not a rebuke. "We shouldn't. This is wrong." He answered her not with words, but by deepening the kiss, his hand moving from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her gently but firmly, as if to say, "I'm not letting you go." And that was all it took. A dam inside her, built over years of quiet neglect and polite smiles, finally broke. A wave of long-suppressed need, of a desperate, aching desire to be touched, to be truly felt, crashed over her, washing away every last vestige of resistance. Her protest died in her throat, replaced by a low moan that was part pleasure, part pain. Her fingers, which had been pushing feebly against his chest, curled into the soft fabric of his shirt, clinging to him. She kissed him back with a ferocity that surprised them both, a desperate, hungry kiss that was about so much more than physical attraction. It was a kiss of recognition, a collision of two lonely souls who had found a temporary harbor in each other. The soft cushions of the sofa felt wrong, too much a part of the life she was betraying. As if reading her mind, Liam broke the kiss, his breathing as ragged as her own. He looked at her, his hazel eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name, and without a word, he scooped her into his arms. The world tilted. She let out a small gasp as he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The feeling of being carried, of surrendering all control, was intoxicating. Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she buried her face in the warm curve of his shoulder, inhaling his scent, the earthy mix of cedar and rain that had become her own private addiction. He carried her up the stairs, his steps sure and steady, each one taking her further away from her life as Mark's wife and deeper into this uncharted, forbidden territory. He bypassed the master bedroom, the sterile, silent room she shared with her husband, and instead carried her into the guest room, his room. It was a space that was now theirs alone. He set her down gently in the center of the room, the only light coming from the hallway, casting them both in long, dancing shadows. They stood for a moment, just looking at each other, their chests rising and falling in unison. Then, with a slow, deliberate reverence, he reached for the sash of her silk robe. His knuckles brushed the skin of her waist as he untied it, and the robe slid from her shoulders, pooling in a dark, shimmering circle at her feet. She stood before him in the black lace lingerie, feeling both exposed and incredibly powerful under his smoldering gaze. His eyes drank her in, not with crude lust, but with the appreciative awe of an artist beholding something beautiful and rare. He traced the delicate edge of the lace on her collarbone with one finger. "Mark's a fool," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A blind fool." His words were an absolution. He undressed her slowly, his hands and mouth exploring her body with an unhurried, worshipful attention that made her tremble. He discovered the sensitive skin behind her ear, the ticklish spot on her ribs, the way her breath hitched when he kissed the inside of her wrist. In return, her hands, clumsy at first, then growing bolder, explored him. The hard planes of his chest, the intricate lines of his tattoos, the taut muscles of his back. Their clothes were shed, discarded remnants of a world that no longer existed. There was only the sound of the storm outside and the storm they were creating within the four walls of this room. When he finally brought their bodies together, it was a moment of profound, earth-shattering release. This wasn't the quiet, perfunctory act she had grown accustomed to. This was chaos and passion, a frantic, desperate dance of need. It was the physical manifestation of every shared secret, every stolen glance, every whispered conversation. It was messy and raw and overwhelmingly real. Her mind, which had been screaming warnings just moments before, went blessedly silent. There were no thoughts, only sensations. The feel of his skin, slick and hot against hers, the sound of his name, a desperate prayer on her lips, the taste of him, a mix of wine and want. The world narrowed to this bed, to this man, to the incredible spiraling pleasure he was building inside her. Her initial whispers of protest had long since transformed into moans of pure, unadulterated need, her body arching to meet his every movement. As he pushed her closer and closer to the edge, she felt a pleasure so intense it bordered on pain, a feeling so powerful it threatened to shatter her into a million pieces. "Liam," she cried out, her voice breaking, her nails digging into his shoulders. Oh God, right there. The first thing she became aware of was the light. It was a merciless, pearly gray morning light, filtering through the blinds in sharp, incriminating stripes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and unnervingly silent. The only sound was the steady, deep breathing of the man beside her. Alara opened her eyes slowly, and the reality of the situation crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She was in the guest room. She was in Liam's bed. His arm was draped possessively over her waist, his hand resting on her hip, and his face, so peaceful in sleep, was turned towards her. In the unforgiving light of day, the raw, intoxicating passion of the previous night curdled into something sour and shameful. Every detail of the room seemed to mock her, her silk robe discarded on a chair like a shedskin, their clothes tangled together on the floor in a damning pile, the lingering scent of sex and sweat in the air. This wasn't a dream. This was a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. A cold panic seized her. Moving with the stealth of a thief, she carefully lifted his heavy arm from her body, inch by painstaking inch, her breath held tight in her chest. He stirred, murmuring something unintelligible in his sleep, and she froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. But he didn't wake. She slipped from the bed, the cool air on her bare skin feeling like a judgment. She gathered her clothes, her hands trembling so much she could barely hold on to the slippery silk, and fled the room, closing the door behind her with a barely audible click. She didn't stop until she was back in the master bedroom, her sanctuary, a space that now felt alien and contaminated by her betrayal. The room was just as Mark had left it, neat, orderly, and smelling faintly of his expensive aftershave. It was the room of a man she had vowed to love and honor. And there, on her nightstand, was the proof of that vow, the silver-framed wedding photograph. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the glass. It was taken on a perfect, sunny day. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a naive, uncomplicated happiness she could barely recognize. Now, Mark stood beside her, his arm around her, his expression proud and proprietary. They looked like the perfect couple, the embodiment of a dream she had once believed in. A wave of nausea rolled through her. She had shattered that image, had taken that smiling, hopeful girl in the photograph and tainted her with a secret, so sordid it felt like a physical stain on her skin. The guilt was a living thing, a cold, heavy creature coiling in the pit of her stomach. She showered in water as hot as she could stand, scrubbing at her skin as if she could wash away his touch, his scent, the memory of her own shameless cries of pleasure. She dressed herself in armor, a pair of stiff, dark jeans and a high-necked, shapeless sweater. She pulled her hair back into a severe, tight bun. She was trying to reconstruct the woman she had been before last night, but it felt like dressing a mannequin. When she finally forced herself to go downstairs, she found him already in the kitchen, standing by the counter, nursing a mug of coffee. He was dressed, his hair was still damp from his own shower, and the easy, comfortable way he occupied the space was gone. He stood stiffly, his shoulders tense. The air between them, which had once been filled with easy laughter and quiet understanding, was now thick with a suffocating, unbearable awkwardness. "Morning," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the coffee machine. "I made coffee," she replied, her voice sounding strange and formal to her own ears. The simple domestic ritual they had built over the last few weeks was now a minefield. She poured herself a mug, her movements jerky, and sat at the kitchen island, placing a deliberate, safe distance between them. They sat in a silence that was louder than any argument, the only sound, the occasional, self-conscious clink of ceramic on granite. She knew she had to be the one to speak, to take control, to try and put this monstrous thing back in its box. She cleared her throat. "Liam," she began, and his head snapped up, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Was it regret, confusion, or something that looked dangerously like tenderness? She couldn't allow it to be tenderness. "About last night," she continued, her voice gaining a brittle strength born of sheer panic. "It was a mistake." He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, forcing her to continue. "It was a moment of weakness. The storm, the wine. We were both feeling lonely and emotional. That's all it was." She was trying to shrink the event, to categorize it, to strip it of its earth-shattering significance and reduce it to a clinical, logical explanation. She was lying, to him and to herself, and the taste of the lie was bitter in her mouth. "It meant nothing," she added, the words feeling like a betrayal of the profound connection she had felt in his arms. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but laced with an edge of disbelief. "Nothing, Alara. Is that really what you think it was?" His question unsettled her. He wasn't supposed to challenge the narrative she was desperately trying to build. He was supposed to agree, to be ashamed, to make this easy. "It has to be," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Because it can't happen again, Liam. Ever." The words hung in the air between them, an ultimatum, a desperate plea. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. He looked down at his coffee mug, turning it slowly in his hands. He looked tired, older than he had the day before. Finally, he looked back at her and gave a slow, reluctant nod. "You're right," he said, and a wave of relief so intense it almost made her dizzy washed over her. "It was a mistake. I never should have. I put you in an impossible position. I'm sorry." He agreed to her terms, to her version of the story. They made a pact, a fragile, unspoken agreement to erase the night from their history, to bury the memory so deep it could never be unearthed. They would go back to being a sister-in-law and a brother-in-law. They would be family. They would be normal. But as they sat there, finishing their coffee in a new, more painful kind of silence, Alara knew it was a fool's promise. The secret was there, sitting between them at the kitchen island. She was acutely aware of the way the muscles in his forearms tensed as he gripped his mug, of the way his scent still seemed to cling to her own skin despite her desperate scrubbing. They could agree that it meant nothing. They could promise it would never happen again. But their bodies knew the truth. Their bodies remembered everything. The pact wasn't a resolution. It was just a different kind of lie, and the house was now haunted by a ghost of their own making. Mark returned on Saturday afternoon, his silver Tesla gliding silently into the driveway, a stark and unwelcome intrusion into the fragile, charged quiet that had descended upon the house. The sound of the garage door rolling up was like a siren, jolting Alara from the trance of the past few days. She pasted a bright, welcoming smile on her face, a mask that felt stiff and foreign, and went to greet him. He stepped into the house, bringing with him the scent of airport lounges and the restless energy of the outside world. He kissed her, a brief, dry peck on the lips, and his touch felt alien, a trespass on a mouth that now held the memory of his brother's passion. "I missed you," he said, handing her a small, elegantly wrapped box containing a pair of expensive but impersonal earrings. She murmured the appropriate thanks, her voice sounding hollow and distant. Her eyes darted over his shoulder, catching Liam's gaze as he stood in the archway to the living room. His face was a blank canvas, revealing nothing, but his eyes, for a fraction of a second, held a flicker of shared conspiracy, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental secret that now lived between the three of them. The warden had returned to the prison. The first dinner together was an exercise in excruciating tension. Mark, oblivious and energized from his successful trip, dominated the conversation, recounting anecdotes about his meetings, praising the food at a restaurant, and outlining his plans for the next quarter. Alara and Liam sat opposite each other, two silent, guilty statues, pushing food around their plates. Alara could feel the heat of Liam's leg, just inches from her own under the table, a proximity that was both a comfort and an agony. Every time Mark would laugh, every time he'd reach out and casually touch her hand, Alara would flinch internally. She felt like a fraud, a shell of a wife, her body present at the dinner table while her mind was trapped in the memory of a darkened guest room. To look at Mark was to see Liam. His brother's features were a softer, more romantic echo of her husband's. And now, when she looked at the familiar lines of Mark's face, her treacherous mind would superimpose the memory of Liam's expression in the throes of passion. Guilt was a constant, a low, nauseating hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. But something else was growing alongside it, something dark and insidious. It was a craving. Their pact, their desperate promise of never again, was a lie they had told themselves to survive the morning after. But the memory of the night was not a ghost to be exorcised. It had become a drug, and she was in the throes of a deep and powerful withdrawal. Lying in her marital bed at night, inches from Mark's sleeping, oblivious body, she would close her eyes and be transported back to Liam's arms. She would remember the strength in his hands, the taste of his mouth, the sound of her own name whispered in a voice thick with desire. The shame was still there, but it was now tangled with a thrilling, electric longing. The presence of Mark, the constant, looming threat of discovery, didn't dampen this desire. It amplified it. The risk became the ultimate aphrodisiac. The house was no longer a home. It was a chessboard, and she and Liam were learning to navigate it, moving in silent, calculated opposition to the king. The promise held for 3 agonizing days. 3 days of stilted small talk, of carefully averted eyes, of a palpable tension that made the air in every room feel thin and hard to breathe. Then, on the 4th day, it shattered. Mark was in his home office on an extended conference call, his voice a muffled drone from behind the closed door. Alara was in the kitchen, unloading the dishwasher, her movements mechanical. Liam walked in to get a glass of water. He didn't speak. He simply stood by the sink, and his eyes met hers over the open door of the dishwasher. The look was all it took. It was a question, a plea, and a confirmation all in one. The world seemed to fall away. The house grew silent, and in that moment, they were the only 2 people in existence. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, and she leaned into his touch with a desperate, involuntary sigh. The kiss was frantic, a starved, breathless collision. That stolen kiss opened the floodgates. The addiction had taken hold, and they began to seek out their fix in the hidden corners of the house, their encounters fueled by a potent cocktail of lust and adrenaline. Their new relationship was forged in whispers and frantic stolen moments. One afternoon, under the guise of doing laundry, they met in the small utility room. The rhythmic, violent thumping of the washing machine in its spin cycle was a frantic heartbeat, a cover for their own ragged breathing. He pressed her back against the vibrating machine, the warmth of the adjacent dryer seeping into her clothes. There was no tenderness, no slow seduction. It was a raw, almost feral act of mutual need, a frantic fumbling with belts and zippers in the cramped space that smelled of bleach and detergent. It was over in minutes, a silent, desperate coupling that left them both breathless, their bodies trembling, listening for the sound of Mark's footsteps in the hall. Another time, it was the backyard shed. Alara had feigned a need to find an old terracotta pot. Liam had followed a few minutes later. In the dusty, spiderweb dimness surrounded by the smell of potting soil and rusted metal, he had pushed her gently against a workbench, lifting her onto it. Through a grimy window pane, they could see the back of the house, see Mark moving around in the brightly lit kitchen, a silent film playing just yards away. The proximity to discovery was terrifying and wildly arousing. Their movements were quick, their moans swallowed by the thick, dusty air, their pleasure sharpened to a razor's edge by the very real danger of being caught. They became experts in deception, masters of the fleeting touch. A secret squeeze of the hand as they passed in the hallway, a lingering look across the living room that held 1,000 unspeakable words, a hasty, deep kiss in the darkness of the pantry. Alara was living a dizzying double life. To Mark, she was the attentive, if somewhat distracted wife. But in the shadows, she was a stranger to herself, a reckless creature driven by a hunger she could no longer control. The guilt was a constant companion, but the thrill, the intoxicating feeling of being truly, desperately wanted, was a high she couldn't give up. One evening, after a particularly risky encounter in the upstairs linen closet, she walked back into the living room, her heart still pounding, her lips feeling bruised and swollen. She sat down on the sofa, picking up a magazine with trembling hands. Mark looked up from his laptop, a slight frown on his face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with casual concern. "You look flushed." She forced a laugh, the sound brittle and fake. "Oh, I just ran up the stairs too fast." The lie came easily. Too easily. She was living on a razor's edge, and with every stolen touch, every secret kiss, she was inching closer and closer to the fall. The call came late on a Friday afternoon. Mark's voice was jovial, slightly strained from the noise of a crowded room. "Hey, Honorable. Listen, the partners are insisting we all go out for a team dinner tonight. Mandatory fun, you know how at Island. It's gonna be a late one, so please don't wait up." Ilara stood by the window, watching the autumn sun begin its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. "Okay," she said, her own voice remarkably calm. "Have fun." The moment she ended the call, she turned. Liam was standing in the doorway of the study, holding a book. He hadn't heard the words, but he had heard the tone. He saw the shift in her posture, the subtle relaxation of her shoulders. He raised a questioning eyebrow. "Mark has a company dinner," she said, and the simple statement hung in the air, pregnant with possibility. The frantic, desperate energy that had fueled their recent encounters was gone, replaced by a quiet, humming anticipation. The fear of being caught, the adrenaline of the stolen moment, had been stripped away, leaving only the truth of their desire and the luxurious, terrifying gift of time. An entire night stretched before them, a blank canvas. There was no need for words, no seduction necessary. A silent agreement passed between them in a single, lingering look. This would not be a frantic coupling in a dusty shed or a hurried encounter against a rattling machine. Tonight was different. Tonight was an indulgence. They moved through the house with a quiet, collaborative grace, preparing their sanctuary. Liam knelt before the great stone fireplace in the living room, a space usually reserved for sterile, Mark-approved holiday gatherings, and skillfully built a fire. Soon, the crackle and pop of burning oak filled the silence, casting a warm, dancing glow across the room. Alara went to the wine rack and retrieved a bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon, One Mark had been saving for a special occasion. This, she thought with a pang of defiant guilt, was a special occasion. She lit a few unscented candles, placing them around the room, their small flames adding to the soft, intimate light. She turned off the harsh overhead lamps, plunging the world into a warm, flickering cocoon of their own making. The storm outside was gone, but they had created a new one inside, a quiet, deliberate tempest of the senses. They settled onto the thick, white sheepskin rug before the hearth, the fire warming their faces. For a long while, they just sat, sipping the dark, velvety wine, listening to the fire's song. They were no longer the nervous, guilty conspirators of the morning after. The physical act had already happened, breaking the ultimate taboo, and in its wake, it had paradoxically created a space for a new, more profound intimacy to grow. He asked her about the house, not as Mark's brother admiring the architecture, but as one artist to another. He wanted to know which rooms she loved, which ones felt cold to her. She, in turn, asked him about the stories behind his tattoos, and he traced the ink on his skin, telling her of a wild night in Bangkok, a lonely winter in Montreal, a summer of love in Barcelona. They were filling in the outlines of each other, learning the histories that had shaped them into the people who were now kneeling before a fire, about to betray the man who connected them. The air grew thick, heavy with wine and unspoken want. He put his glass down and turned to face her fully, his expression serious, his gaze intense. "Come here," he whispered, and it was a gentle command. She moved closer, the soft wool of the rug brushing against her bare legs. He didn't kiss her. Instead, he reached out, his touch impossibly soft, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His eyes, the color of moss and whiskey in the firelight, roamed her face, her neck, her shoulders, as if he were seeing her for the very first time. "You know," he said, his voice a low, reverent murmur, "when I look at you, I see in compositions the graceful curve of your neck, the line of your collarbone, the shadow that falls right here." His finger traced a delicate path from her shoulder down into the hollow of her throat, sending a shiver through her entire body. He looked at her, his artist's soul bare in his eyes. "Every curve of your body tells a story, Alara. I wish I had a lifetime to learn how to read them." His words were more intimate than any touch, a validation of her very being that went beyond the physical. He saw her as art. He saw her as a story worth reading. In his eyes, she was not a neglected wife or a guilty adulteress. She was a masterpiece. And with that, the last of her defenses crumbled into dust. He undressed her with the same unhurried, worshipful reverence. Each button undone, each piece of fabric slid away, was an act of devotion. He learned her body with his hands and his mouth, discovering the places that made her sigh, the touches that made her gasp. This was not the frantic, almost violent passion of their first time. This was a slow, languid exploration, a mutual act of discovery. She, in turn, felt a new boldness, a confidence she had never known. Her hands explored the hard, warm landscape of his body, learning the ridges of his spine, the muscles of his back, the texture of the hair on his chest. It was a silent, sensual conversation, their bodies speaking a language their voices could not. He laid her back on the soft fur of the rug, the warmth of the fire on one side of her body, the heat of his on the other. As he moved over her, he paused, his face inches from hers. "Alara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that mirrored the ache in her own chest. "Look at me." She opened her eyes, which she hadn't realized she'd closed, and met his gaze. It was a command to be present, to not retreat into her guilt, to be here, with him, in this moment, to truly see him as he was seeing her. As they moved together, it was a slow, perfect rhythm, a dance as old as time, performed just for them. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no Mark, no marriage, no betrayal. There was only the fire, the music, the scent of wine and burning wood, and the incredible soul-deep connection with the man who was making her feel alive for the first time in a decade. The pleasure built slowly, a deep, rising tide within her, and when it finally crested, it was not a sharp, frantic peak, but an overwhelming, shuddering wave of release that shook her to her very core. A choked sob escaped her lips, and hot tears streamed from the corners of her eyes, tracing paths through the hair at her temples. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy, for feeling so completely, so perfectly seen and wanted. And they were tears of the most profound, heartbreaking sorrow for the beautiful, impossible tragedy of their love, a perfect moment built on a foundation of deceit. He held her through it, kissing the tears from her skin, whispering her name until the shudders subsided. As the fire died down to a bed of glowing, winking embers, they lay tangled together on the rug, their bodies slick with sweat, the silence no longer awkward or guilty, but full of a deep, resonant intimacy. They had done more than just make love. They had shared souls. And in doing so, they had crossed a threshold into a territory far more dangerous than reckless lust. They were no longer just addicted to the thrill. They were terrifyingly, irrevocably addicted to each other. The aftermath of their night by the fire was not a return to guilt-ridden awkwardness, but something far more perilous, a descent into a comfortable, domestic intimacy. The line between sister-in-law and lover had been erased, replaced by a bond that was quiet, profound, and increasingly difficult to hide. They had moved beyond the frantic, animalistic need of their stolen moments into a realm of shared glances, inside jokes, and a silent, intuitive understanding of one another. They were a we, a secret, two-person nation existing within the borders of a life that belonged to Mark. And Mark, for all his work-related distraction, was not a fool. He was an architect. He was a man trained to see the subtle shifts in a foundation, to notice when a structure was no longer sound. And his own home, the life he had so carefully designed, was beginning to show cracks. The change began as something he couldn't quite name. He noticed Alara was humming as she made breakfast, a soft, melodic sound he hadn't heard in years. There was a new light in her eyes, a vibrancy to her skin. At first, he was pleased. He assumed his successful trip, the stability he provided, was the source of her newfound contentment. But he soon realized this happiness was a private, walled garden, and he was on the outside, looking in. The first tangible piece of evidence was small, almost insignificant. One morning, as Alara prepared coffee, she moved with an unconscious grace, placing a mug in front of Liam, adding a splash of milk and a generous dash of cinnamon without even asking. "Thanks," Liam had mumbled, smiling at her. Mark watched the exchange, a tiny frown creasing his brow. "Wow," he said, forcing a light-hearted tone. "You've got his order down pat." Alara froze for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the sugar bowl. "Oh," she said, her laugh a little too high, a little too bright. "Well, he's just been here for a while, you know. I remember things like that. It's nothing." Her explanation was too long, her justification too detailed. It was the answer of someone who had just been caught in a lie, even if the question hadn't been an accusation. Mark said nothing, but he filed the moment away. The small anomalies began to accumulate. At dinner, Liam would mention an obscure artist or a piece of classical music, and Alara, who had always deferred to Mark's more mainstream tastes, would immediately engage, her eyes bright with a knowledge and passion Mark had never seen. "Oh, I love that piece," she'd say. "Liam played it for me the other day. It's so beautifully melancholic." Mark would look from his wife to his brother, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "When did he play music for you?" he'd wonder. A whole world of shared experiences was being built in his own home, right under his nose, during the long hours he was at the office. Her physical presence changed, too. In their bed at night, she had become a distant, remote figure. She would turn away from him, her body rigid, feigning sleep with a stillness that was just a little too perfect. If he reached for her, she would flinch, a barely perceptible tensing of her muscles, before relaxing into his touch with a forced, pliant surrender that felt worse than outright rejection. Her phone, once a casual accessory left on the coffee table, or the kitchen counter, was now her constant companion, always kept screen down or angled away from his view. He decided to test the waters, to cast a line into the murky depths of their new dynamic to see what he might pull up. It was a Sunday afternoon. He and Alara were in the living room, reading. Liam was in the backyard, absorbed in photographing the changing autumn leaves. It was a peaceful, domestic scene. You know, Mark said, his voice casual as he turned a page in his magazine. You and my brother seem to get along really well. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Alara lowered her book, her expression guarded. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her tone defensive. He's your brother, Mark. He's our guest. Of course I'm being nice to him. I want him to feel welcome. I know, Mark said, keeping his own voice even, placating. I just mean, you seem to have a lot in common. It's nice to see. Her overreaction was the tell. An innocent person would have simply agreed, but Alara was no longer innocent. She saw accusation in his observation, suspicion in his casual words, because she herself was brimming with guilt. The conversation ended, but the unspoken question lingered in the air for the rest of the day, a toxic, invisible gas. For Alara, life had become a tightrope walk over a canyon of lies. Every interaction with Mark was a performance, every question a potential trap. His simple query of "How was your day?" would send her mind scrambling, constructing a plausible narrative, carefully editing out the long, quiet lunch she and Liam had shared, the movie they had watched, the charged silence that had fallen between them. She was becoming a meticulous historian of her own fabrications. The strain was beginning to wear on her. She was jumpy, her nerves frayed. The sound of Mark's car in the driveway would send a jolt of adrenaline through her, forcing her and Liam to spring apart if they were sitting too close, to wipe the shared intimacy from their faces and replace it with masks of polite neutrality. The lies were constant, exhausting, and they were breeding. One lie, told to cover a shared lunch, would necessitate another about why she wasn't hungry at dinner. A lie about a headache, used to avoid intimacy with Mark, would beget another about the medication she was taking. Her life had become a complex, suffocating web of her own creation. One evening, she was curled on the sofa, smiling at a text message from Liam, who was in his room. It was a simple, tender message, a callback to a joke they had shared earlier. She was so lost in the warm, private glow of the message that she didn't hear Mark approach. "What's so funny?" he asked, his voice directly behind her. She gasped, snapping her phone shut with a panicked reflex, her heart hammered against her ribs. "Nothing," she said, turning to face him, forcing a smile. "Just a silly cat video a friend sent me." The lie was flimsy, pathetic, and she knew it. The look on his face told her he didn't believe it either. He didn't press the issue, but his eyes were cold, distant. He knew she was hiding something. That night, as he lay in bed beside her, Mark stared at the ceiling, the pieces clicking into place in his methodical mind. The shared jokes, the knowledge of his coffee, her distance, her jumpiness, her phone, the way she looked at his brother when she thought no one was watching. The idea was monstrous, a violation of the two most sacred bonds in his life. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting, building a case that was becoming impossible to ignore. He rolled over, looking at the back of his wife's head in the darkness. She was a stranger, and for the first time in his life, Mark was afraid of what he might find in his own home. Complacency is a quiet poison. The constant simmering fear of discovery had, over time, lost its sharpest edge, dulling into a familiar, low-grade hum that became the background noise of their lives. Alara and Liam had grown accustomed to their double existence, becoming so adept at the intricate dance of deception that they had started to believe they were invincible. Their stolen moments, once fraught with panicked adrenaline, had taken on a comfortable, almost routine quality. The risk was still there, a ghost at the feast, but they had learned to dine with it, to ignore its chilling presence. This carelessness, born from repeated success, was a fatal flaw, a crack in their carefully constructed facade that was about to be shattered. It happened on a Tuesday, a day of unremarkable gray skies and a steady, drizzling rain. Mark had a series of back-to-back meetings downtown and had texted earlier to say he would be grabbing a late dinner with a client. The house was theirs until at least 9. The kitchen had become their preferred territory, a place of warmth and shared domesticity that made their illicit acts feel somehow more grounded, more real. Alara was at the stove, stirring a risotto, the rhythmic motion a soothing balm to her ever-present anxiety. Liam came up behind her, not to steal a kiss, but simply to lean against the counter and watch her cook. They fell into the easy, shorthand banter of lovers, their voices low, their laughter soft. The mundane act of preparing a meal became an intimate ballet. He would reach around her to grab a spice from the rack, his chest brushing her back, an intentionally lingering touch that sent a familiar jolt through her. She would turn to hand him a spoon to taste the sauce, her fingers grazing his, their eyes meeting over the rising steam in a look that held entire conversations. It was in one of these moments, as she turned back to the stove, that he stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his body. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "You smell like home," he murmured into her ear, his voice a low vibration that resonated through her. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her eyes closing in a moment of pure, unguarded bliss. It was a perfect, peaceful moment of stolen love. And then, the world ended. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, mechanical whir, a sound so common it should have been meaningless. The sound of the garage door opener. For a full second, her brain refused to process it. It was impossible. Mark was downtown. Mark was with a client. The sound came again, followed by the familiar, heavy rumble of the door sliding up its tracks. It was him. He was home. The bliss of a moment before curdled into pure, ice-cold terror. Her heart didn't just pound. It stopped dead in her chest for a terrifying instant before restarting in a frantic, wild gallop that she could feel in her throat. "Mark," she breathed, the name a strangled, panicked whisper. They sprang apart as if electrocuted. Their movements were clumsy, jagged with adrenaline. She spun back to the stove, grabbing the spoon and stirring the risotto with a hand that trembled so violently she could barely hold on. Liam stumbled back towards the far counter, running a hand through his hair, his own face a mask of pale shock. There was no time to think, no time to compose themselves, no time to erase the guilty intimacy that was still hanging in the air like a thick, visible fog. The door from the garage into the kitchen swung open. Mark walked in, shrugging off his raincoat. He was smiling, a tired but pleased expression on his face. "Client canceled last minute," he announced cheerfully. "Figured I'd surprise you and be home for." His voice trailed off. His smile froze, then slowly dissolved as he took in the scene before him. The atmosphere in the kitchen, which had been warm and fragrant seconds before, was now icy, silent, and stretched as taut as a bowstring. He saw his wife, her back ramrod straight, staring into a pot on the stove with a terrifying, fixed intensity. He saw his brother, leaning against the counter as if trying to physically merge with the granite, his knuckles white where he gripped its edge. He saw the space between them, a 6-foot chasm that felt charged with 1,000 volts of unspoken electricity. He saw the flush on Alara's cheeks and the faint dishevelment of Liam's shirt. His architect's mind, trained to see every detail, took it all in, and the cheerful light in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, analytical glint. His gaze moved from Alara to Liam and back again, his expression unreadable, his silence a deafening accusation. Alara's mind was a white noise of pure panic. "It's over," the thought screamed on a loop. "He knows. He saw. Our lives are over." She was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, completely incapable of speech or rational thought. It was Liam who broke the silence, his voice rough, but surprisingly steady. He cleared his throat and pushed himself off the counter, forcing a pained, grim expression onto his face. "Hey, Mark," he said, his tone heavy with a fabricated sorrow. "Sorry. You just walked in on a bit of a moment." Mark's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, waiting. Liam ran a hand over his face, a gesture of pure theatrical despair. "I just got an email," he lied, his voice cracking slightly for effect. "A gallery in New York. A big one I've been trying to get into for years. They rejected the portfolio I submitted. A pretty harsh rejection, actually." He let out a short, bitter laugh. Alara was just, being a good sister, giving me a pep talk. The lie was plausible. It was creative. It accounted for the tension, for Alara's flushed face, for his own distraught appearance. It was a masterpiece of improvisation born from sheer terror. Mark stood there for a long, agonizing moment, his cold, suspicious gaze still shifting between them. Alara held her breath, convinced her heart would explode. She could see that he didn't fully believe it. The story fit, but it didn't feel right. The air of guilt was too thick, the panic in her eyes too real. But to challenge the story was to make an accusation of monstrous proportions. To voice the suspicion that was solidifying in his mind was to declare a war he wasn't yet ready to fight. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible sigh of resignation, he nodded. "Oh," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any sympathy. "I see. Well, that's tough luck, Liam." He dropped his briefcase onto a kitchen chair with a thud that made Alara jump. "I'm gonna go change." He walked out of the room without another word, without a backward glance, leaving a chilling, arctic silence in his wake. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew they were not safe. The thrill of the affair, the intoxicating pleasure, had vanished completely. All that remained was the stark, visceral terror of the near miss. Later that night, lying in bed next to a husband who felt like a stranger, the wall of his silence, an impassable fortress, Alara was haunted by the memory of the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had seen the truth, even if he was not yet willing to name it. The fire of their passion, which had once felt like a life-giving warmth, now felt like a raging, uncontrollable inferno that had come within a hair's breadth of burning their entire world to the ground. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they had just used up all of their luck. The near miss in the kitchen was not a warning shot. It was a direct hit, a cannonball that blew a hole through the side of their fragile, secret world, exposing them to the cold, harsh light of consequence. The house, which had once been their playground of illicit passion, transformed overnight into a mausoleum. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, punctuated only by the stilted, painfully polite cadence of their three-person meals. Mark's suspicion was no longer a quiet, internal process. It was a fourth entity at the table, a cold, invisible guest who watched their every move. He stopped asking questions. Instead, he simply observed them with a cool, detached scrutiny that was far more terrifying than any accusation. His politeness toward Liam became a weapon, each please and thank you sharpened with an edge of ice. The atmosphere was unbearable, a low-pressure system of unspoken resentment and paranoia that left Alara feeling as though she couldn't draw a full breath in her own home. The joy of the affair had evaporated, leaving behind only a toxic residue of fear and self-loathing. Alara was unraveling. Sleep offered no escape, her dreams filled with the sound of the garage door opening and the image of Mark's frozen, knowing smile. She moved through her days like a ghost, her appetite gone, her body thrumming with a constant, high-frequency anxiety. Every time Mark looked at her, she felt like a specimen under a microscope, her guilt and deceit laid bare for his cold, analytical gaze. The love she had felt for Liam, a feeling that had once seemed like a life raft in the empty ocean of her marriage, now felt like a millstone dragging her down into the abyss. She looked at her reflection and saw a stranger, a reckless, selfish woman who had gambled her entire life for a series of stolen moments that now felt like a distant, foolish dream. Liam, too, was buckling under the weight of their transgression. He was no longer the charming, carefree artist who had swept into her life. He was a man tormented by the direct consequences of his actions. He saw the haunted, terrified look in Alara's eyes and knew he was the cause. More painfully, he saw the change in his brother. Mark, who had always been a source of stability and slightly overbearing pride, now looked at him with a stranger's eyes. The easy, brotherly affection was gone, replaced by a guarded, painful distance. Liam was living under the roof of the man he had betrayed, eating his food, breathing his air, and the guilt was a physical sickness, a constant, bitter taste in the back of his throat. He had come to this house seeking refuge, and had instead become its saboteur. The breaking point came a week after the kitchen incident. The tension had become a living, breathing monster, consuming all the air in the house. A decision had to be made. Liam asked Alara to meet him, not in a hidden corner of their home, but outside, at a small, windswept park overlooking the river. The sky was a uniform, overcast gray, the perfect backdrop for the conversation they were about to have. They sat on a cold, damp bench, a respectable distance between them, two strangers sharing a public space. For a long time, neither of them spoke, their gazes fixed on the murky, churning water. It was Liam who finally broke the silence, his voice low and raspy. "We can't do this anymore, Lara." It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a statement of undeniable, heartbreaking fact. "I know," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was nearly stolen by the wind. He turned to look at her then, his face etched with a pain that mirrored her own. "I watch him," Liam said, his voice thick with shame. "I watch what this is doing to him. To you. I came here to put my life back together, and instead I've taken a sledgehammer to yours. And to his." This was the moment for the truth. The final, painful confession. "It wasn't just you, Liam," Alara said, tears finally welling in her eyes, hot and stinging in the cold air. "I was so lonely. And then you came, and you saw me. You really saw me." Her voice broke. It wasn't just the thrill. It wasn't just sex. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the bench before he seemed to think better of it, letting it drop. "I know," he said, his own voice ragged with emotion. "For me, either. I think. Somewhere along the way, Alara, I fell in love with you." The words, finally spoken aloud, were both a beautiful release and an unbearable agony. "I love you too," she confessed to the gray river, because she couldn't bear to say it while looking at his face. They sat with that impossible truth, the love they could never claim, the future they could never have. It was a beautiful, tragic thing that had grown in a poisoned garden, and they both knew it had to be uprooted. "I've been looking for work," he said, shifting the conversation to the grim, practical reality. "I got an offer yesterday. A photography gig for an adventure travel company. It's good. It's real." She looked at him, a flicker of hope warring with a sense of dread. "Where?" "It's based in Denver," he said, and the distance, the sheer number of miles in that name, was a physical blow. It was the solution. It was the only solution. A clean break. An amputation to save the patient. "It's the only way," he said softly, as if reading her mind. "I have to go. I have to disappear from your lives, so you two can have a chance to heal." His day of departure arrived with a cruel, unseasonable brightness. The sun shone. The sky was a brilliant blue, a mockery of the oppressive gloom that had settled permanently inside the house. He packed his dusty Subaru, the same car that had brought so much life and chaos into her driveway just a few short months ago. Mark was there, helping, his movements efficient, his words sparse. He was playing the part of the supportive older brother, but his relief was palpable. He was an executioner, politely seeing the condemned to the gallows. Alara stood on the porch, a statue carved from ice, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She couldn't cry. She couldn't touch him. She couldn't say any of the 1,000 things that were screaming in her heart. Liam finished packing and closed the hatchback with a final, definitive thud. He turned, and his eyes found hers across the driveway. For one last, eternal second, their gazes locked, and in that silent, stolen moment, they said everything. "I love you. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'll never forget you. Goodbye." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, then got into the car without a backward glance. Mark clapped him on the shoulder through the open window, a hollow gesture of farewell. The engine rumbled to life. Alara stood, frozen, as the green Subaru backed out of the driveway, turned onto the street, and disappeared. The sound of its engine faded, leaving behind an aching, profound silence. The problem was gone. The affair was over. Mark turned and went back into the house, leaving her alone on the porch. She had what she wanted. She had saved her marriage. But as she stood there, staring at the empty street, she had never felt so utterly, devastatingly alone. Liam's departure did not bring peace. It brought a silence so profound, so heavy, it felt like a physical presence in the house. His absence was a phantom limb, a constant, aching void that Alara felt with every breath. The guest room door remained closed, a silent monument to a memory she was trying desperately to bury. The kitchen island, once the heart of their secret world, now felt vast and empty. She would find herself pausing as she made coffee in the morning, her hands automatically reaching for the cinnamon, only to remember with a jolt of fresh pain that he was no longer there. The house was no longer haunted by the fear of being caught, but by the ghost of what she had lost. Mark, in his own way, tried to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. He seemed to have accepted Liam's cover story, or at least had chosen to believe it for the sake of his own sanity. With the source of the tension gone, he made an effort. He started coming home earlier. He planned date nights to restaurants she used to love. He would reach for her hand as they watched television, a gesture of ownership and reconciliation. Each attempt at affection was a turn of the screw for Alara. His touch, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a violation. She would endure his kisses, her body pliant but her mind a million miles away, her skin screaming for a touch it could never have again. She would lie beside him in their bed at night, in the crushing darkness, and feel the chasm between them yawn wider than ever. He was sleeping next to his wife, but she had become a stranger, an imposter playing a role. Her performance was flawless. She was the dutiful, loving wife, but inside she was a wasteland of regret. She was a changed woman. The quiet, simmering discontent she had felt before Liam had been a passive thing, a vague sense of emptiness. Now, it had been replaced by a sharp, specific agony. She had tasted life, had felt the intoxicating, terrifying thrill of being truly seen, and the return to her colorless existence was a kind of death. She would look at Mark, at this good, stable man who had given her a beautiful life, and she would feel nothing but a profound, soul-crushing sense of loss. She would see the way he held his fork, the sound of his laugh, the shape of his hands, and her mind would betray her, superimposing the ghost of his brother over him. She was living in a perpetual state of mourning for a love that had no right to exist, a grief she could share with no one. The secret was a poison she had willingly swallowed, and it was slowly, methodically dissolving her from the inside out. Her life had become a quiet, comfortable, and exquisitely painful prison. Months passed. Autumn bled into a cold, wet winter. The house was decorated for the holidays, a mockery of cheer and family that felt like a personal insult to Alara. She moved through the motions, hosting Mark's family for Thanksgiving, smiling through Christmas parties, her heart a frozen heavy stone in her chest. She had not heard from Liam, not a word, not a sign. He had kept his promise. He had disappeared completely, an amputation performed with surgical precision. She told herself it was for the best, that the silence was a necessary part of the healing, but some nights, the longing was so intense it felt like a physical illness. One night, deep in the cold stillness of February, she lay awake, listening to the sound of Mark's steady breathing beside her. Sleep, as it often did, eluded her. She was staring into the darkness when her phone, resting on the nightstand, vibrated with a soft, singular buzz. Her heart, which she had thought was numb, gave a powerful, painful lurch. It was after 2 a.m. No one would be texting her now. With a trembling hand, she reached for it, her thumb hovering over the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, but she knew, with a certainty that made her blood run cold, she knew it was him. She opened the message. There were no words. There was only a photograph. It was a picture of her own eyes, a tight, artistic close-up. He must have taken it one afternoon when she wasn't paying attention. They were exactly as he had described them, sad. But in his photograph, through his lens, he had also captured the flecks of gold in their green depths, the network of fine lines at their corners, the spark of intelligence and buried passion within them. It was a photograph taken by a man who was in love. It was a message, a final, devastating whisper across 1,000 miles that said everything he couldn't. I see you. I remember you. You are still beautiful to me. A single, hot tear slid from the corner of her eye and traced a path to her ear. Then another, and another, until she was crying silently, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it felt like it would tear her apart. He hadn't forgotten. It was real. This thing that had nearly destroyed her life, this thing she had tried to dismiss as a moment of madness, was real. She stared at the image of her own captured soul for a long time, committing every detail to her memory. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, she deleted the message. She blocked the number. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. It was an act of final surrender, a closing of the door on the ghost that haunted her. She placed the phone back on the nightstand and turned onto her side, away from her sleeping husband. The affair was over. The secret was safe. But as she lay there in the silent, suffocating darkness of her perfect life, she understood that her punishment was not a single dramatic event, but a lifelong sentence. She would live out the rest of her days with the ghost of his brother sleeping between them, a constant, silent reminder of the woman she had briefly been and the love she had chosen to sacrifice.